Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. We are the first Shop Talk of 2022. So, welcome, everybody. Hopefully you've had a good couple of weeks. Maybe you've had some time off. Maybe you've been working 80-hour weeks. I don't know. The end of the year actually is a really good time to work 80-hour weeks because nobody bothers you. You actually get stuff done. So, if you're going to work 80 hours, I guess do it at this time of the year. Because otherwise, like 40 of those 80 hours are going to be in meetings. You're on calls. You're having to deal with stuff. It also helps if you don't actually know any people or care about people at all to work 80-hour weeks at the end of the year. So that way you don't have to worry about like family or friends or anything like that. Festivities. None of that stuff. Just focus. Speaking of Fs, we have friendly fellows around. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year.
So, directly beneath us, we're going to go in anti-clockwise order tonight. Mike Christensen, how you doing, Mike?
I'm well, thanks. Happy New Year, everybody. Thanks for having me.
And Mala Mahadevan, how you doing, Mala?
I'm doing well. Happy New Year, everyone.
So, and welcome in Mr. Lysanki. Good to see you. So tonight, we've got one topic that is probably going to take up a lot of time. But in case you're new to Shop Talk, the whole premise of it is you have questions. We may or may not have answers. If we don't have answers, we'll definitely make up answers. Sometimes they'll look really, really new. They'll look like they're absolutely the right answer, and maybe they are. That's kind of the Russian roulette of Shop Talk. How can it snow in the midsummer?
Well, the snow's all gone.
Yeah, actually, I was going to cancel Shop Talk on account of snow, so we had to shut down the state. Just to give everybody the idea, it was upper 30s here, which is approximately, I think, 900 degrees Celsius. I think that's how the conversion goes. So it was upper 30s.
You're using a float.
Yeah, the snow touched the ground. It didn't actually stick to the ground, but it touched the ground. And I'm actually surprised the state didn't declare an emergency. But there's no snow anymore, so we can do Shop Talk tonight. Had a price chart for answers with the bottom line saying dumb looks still free. It's good. It's good. I appreciate that dumb looks can be free. I hate having to pay for dumb looks. But our topic for tonight is code reviews. Code reviews are a big part of the development mentality, but in the data platform space, it's been a little hit and miss, I would say. I think that there's been some emphasis on proper code review technique, but there are challenges that are special to the data world that you don't necessarily have in application development. So I wanted to talk about this topic tonight. Mala actually brought it up, but since she walked off to do important things, and Mike is a man on the go, I guess I'm gonna talk about it. Peer reviews are actual code reviews by a team. The answer is yes, but also no. What I mean by that is, yeah, we can talk about both of them. And actual code reviews by a team, I've been through some of those, but they tend to be so rare. So not a huge amount of experience on code reviews by a whole team, which I suppose otherwise would be known as the firing squad, or static analysis by tools. Yeah, definitely more of the human review of code as opposed to static analysis of tools. That is its own topic. Mala actually had a really great talk on using script DOM for some of that work. So there is some capability in the SQL Server space. Not nearly as much as you have with linters, PyLint or the C linters, the C++ linters, even .NET linters. There's not nearly as much capability in the data platform world, but I guess that's also tied in with the challenge of data platform code review, and that is there are a couple of challenges. One is that in application development, a lot of your code is stateless. You don't have to worry about what is the current state of the whole system. You don't have to worry necessarily about what is the data. At an extreme, if you think about Haskell development or side effect free functional programming, you don't have to think about state at all, because you have the functions, and the functions are going to operate regardless of what the state is. They're not going to modify that outside state. Now, with real programming in the real world, as opposed to theoretical functional programming, actual functional programming or structured programming, object-oriented, however you choose to go with this, there is some thought about state. State does come into play. You have what is the current state in the process, and we also try to minimize the effects that state has. Like, again, focusing on functions that are side effect free, having as many of those as possible, because I can reason through that code and pay closer attention to the stuff that is highly dependent on what the current state of the system is. When you start talking about databases, it's all state all the time. We care entirely about the state. So this procedure that does an update based on this join criterion, we have to understand what is the state of the data. We have to understand a lot more about the system in toto than just the query itself.
That's correct.
So Mala, before we dive into what Mike has, what are your thoughts on the topic?
So I found a few interesting observations when I was working on finding a linter for what we do at work, to automate some of what we do at work. And one is definitely what Kevin said, is that that the databases as a stateful entity makes a huge difference, and it's really very difficult to take away the manual element of that, because only an experienced person who has worked with that particular database knows what is around it, as opposed to somebody else offering up a bunch of generic do's and don'ts, which may be valid. We do need some generic do's and don'ts, but quite a lot of it has to come from the individual knowing the data and knowing the database and what works in that particular for that particular set of data, which may not, it's very hard to generalize. I've looked into some of the other code review tools that we had out there before we did it, and some of them have like rules like no more than 3 tables per query, and like, hello, that kind of stuff. Again, it's very organization, very data set specific. Like, how do you say more than 3 tables per query is something wrong, or it's not going to perform optimally, or there is no such thing. And there's a whole bunch of different rules like that. I forget, I was looking into it just before the holidays started, but coming up with rules that are generally organization specific, it's really difficult to generalize. So generalizing, I would say about 10 to 20% of rules can be generalized, but the vast majority of it is company specific.
Yeah. So a couple of things from Lysanki. Big fan of technical code reviews, but the style reviews sort of suck. I kind of like style reviews as long as the style is not too radically different from mine. There's a lot of hair pulling and, well, I want you to do it this way, and it can be annoying. But at the same time, I've seen so much horribly formatted code. It's like previous job, not the current job I'm in, but a prior job, there were developers who would have their .NET code, and they were also responsible for writing the SQL queries. And they would write these horrible, horrible looking queries in the sense that they were just formatted. They weren't formatted at all. It was just whatever garbage you would throw. And I would ask them, does your C# code look this bad? It's like, no, the C# code looks properly formatted. I know, I could see the C# code. Why do you format that code, but you don't format these SQL queries? And they would run into bugs sometimes where a comma was misplaced or was not added, and so you'd have one column aliased as another column when they really meant two separate columns. Yeah, that stuff is easy to fix if you format things correctly and you have one attribute per line. That way you can see the comma at the end of the line. And then you have working queries. But that's where I think minimalistic style guidelines are going to be important. Make it so that it doesn't look like somebody copy and pasted a bunch of stuff from Stack Overflow and crossed their fingers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Don't understand how with functional programming you'd know where the tail option has changed code in the executable enough that you couldn't tell what state was occurring within a reentrant call recursing. Yeah, though I suppose that's a topic for another day because I'm not sure. I guess, yeah, once you get into tail call recursion in functional programming, there you do get to at what point does this change enough that we now have to understand the process, and that's where, all right, let's talk through it with a table of results of what we would expect. And I think in that scenario, we'd probably write some good tests around it to ensure that sanity prevails. But for a lot of FP, you have inputs, do thing, give outputs. And at least with a pure side effect free function. So I can understand given inputs, do thing, give me outputs. If I understand what that signature is supposed to do, I can read the code, ensure that it does the thing, and then never have to think about that code again whenever I see the call. So that's kind of the plus side there. Not important if you're... Oh, go ahead, Mala.
No, I'm saying, and I'm not picking on this product, but I'm going to paste this link here and see so many of these rules was just what I was saying, very, very organization specific. And there's a pretty big list there that we can discuss and see, some of them are correct, but quite a lot of them are like that, like just what Kevin was saying, like because the database is a stateful entity, it applies for certain databases, not for everything. That's a
Sonar
good list
Cube.
there. Yeah.
All right. Now, Mike has a bunch of rules as well that I do want to get to. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about these Sonar Source rules. And Sonar Source doesn't pay us, so we can say whatever we want about them. Welcome to Shop Talk, where we're never going to make money. Some of these types of rules, this is sort of the static analysis. This is the kind of thing that I don't necessarily need a human to follow. Nullable subqueries should not be used in not in clauses. I understand why, but I don't know about that one.
So look at this one, the second one, the number of variables in a fetch statement. This is SQL will throw that back at you if you do a fetch with a fewer things than what the cursor has. So I'm not sure why you need to go as far as a code review for you to find. It means you're going to throw totally untested code into a code review, then that there's a problem with the programmer there. But this kind of stuff is not going to work at all.
Yeah, or things like top without an order by. Again,
right.
I can understand why, but at the same time, I may just want to return. Here's 10 rows. I don't care about the ordering.
Right.
I do like this website.
selects or deletes random rows. That's fine. Now, again, if there's a purpose, there's an intent here, and a lot of this is the applying of static linting rules to your particular situation. There is no general purpose. These static rules will apply uniformly to every scenario without having to think about it. And that's where static tools are, well, they're tools. They're not going to give you great code.
Right.
If used correctly, they will help improve your code. And some of these, I think, yeah, if used correctly, I understand where this is useful. Like, null should never be compared directly. Yeah, I agree. That is a good static rule that you should never say something equals null, because unless you have ANSI nulls in a weird state, please don't do that.
Right.
Title equals null is not going to give you results. You have to say title is null. So I get that. I think that makes sense. Not
Some
all
of them
these
are pretty good, like well thought out, and I know, yeah.
Well, it seems like some of them would be like they could code it to catch these. Therefore, this is our list.
Sure.
And that's not a criticism of them. It's pretty clever, but
right.
So,
I
like
mean,
the where clause conditions should not be contradictory. So, yeah, I get that. To me, yeah, what Mike is saying, right? If I have a developer who's writing this kind of stuff, then, hey, we need to chat.
yeah.
Yeah.
Although, at the same time, sometimes there are going to be things where, oh, I needed to do this because otherwise the optimizer gave me a really weird result. Like, for example, I needed a top clause, top max big int, because otherwise it was going to try to use a nested loop operator on 10 million rows. And that was, by putting in this top, it reshapes the optimizer to give a query that's, oh, well, let's use a merge join instead. There was a recent blog post I read. I forget who posted it, but they were able to use that top hack to give a little bit of oomph to the query optimizer and get a much better plan out versus the default. Well, if a static tool is going to catch that and say, oh, I don't think you should do this. And in fairness, if a static tool is going to catch this, there should be a comment that says, here's why I'm doing this. Highly language dependent. Yeah, these tools, every static linter is going to be language dependent. It's going to be dependent on the constructs of the language and as well the patterns and practices of the language. Like the stuff that works in Python, the PEP8, you don't want to apply that to C#. It's just not going to work. Not only will you have compiler issues, but even the practices and principles behind those will not always work in every case. Null is often used as a default init pointer type for old languages. This is why we can't have nice things, though. Because
this one I really like. All code should be reachable. I think that's a great rule.
It's a good practice. It's a good principle, yeah.
Yeah.
But again, I can come up with a scenario where maybe this shouldn't be reachable because, for example, we're phasing it out and I can't drop this just yet and I want to keep it around. Maybe I'm not trusting in source control. And actually, there's also, is it reachable in practice? Because there could be conditions in here where, based on the data, based on the state, you can't reach that code. So it goes back to testing. Reviewing database code is hard. There are people who still write assembly here. I was going to say something a little bit tongue-in-cheek, snark about assembly. I was never very good at writing assembly code, so I was able to get the registers to work. The registers did the things that they were supposed to do. It took me a while to do it, but that's about my experience with assembly code. So back on the world of SQL, I think the other thing, as Mala drops out,
What's a jump statement? I'm sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
Oh boy, a jump statement.
Break, continue, return, go to, and throw. Move control flow out of the current code block so statements that come up after a jump code are dead. You don't want to put comments in there so that someone could insert something?
Well, jump is, I'm going to go to this particular section. Oh, there we go. Mala's back.
So it keeps telling you unknown knock status accepted. I wonder what on earth does it mean? But
don't know about that. But let's talk about database stuff instead of stump Kevin with basic assembler level stuff and show that he hasn't even thought about this in 15 years. Because it's actually been closer to 20. Databases. Yes, that's why we're here. We're here for the databases. The other problem I think that we have with code reviews on the data platform side is they tend to be enormous. I have a simple change. Oh, I just need to change this table and the 12 supporting procedures. So I have 13 files to check and making sure that I did it right. You kind of have to understand a lot of the scope of a system because during that code review, I can show you, here are the 13 changes I made. Well, was that all of the references? Did you check the views, triggers, functions, stored procedures? Mm-hmm. Are there any computed columns that depend on this? Mm-hmm. Is there anything that's downstream, service broker, SQL agent jobs, integration services packages?
Right.
You know, you have all of these different components that are not hidden, but it's just having to think about them in such broad scope. With application development, sometimes you are stuck in that as well. I made this one change to a core method in an application. I had to think about the hundreds of different places where it's used in different applications, all the different places those DLLs are dumped off to. But I think that type of change happens a lot less frequently. More often, because we can compile most of this code, assuming you're using a compiler-friendly language, that's going to catch many of those types of references, and there tends to be hopefully a better testing architecture around how things tie together that you don't necessarily see very easily in database world because testing is hard because everything is state-based. In a stateless world, testing's so much easier. I set up the test how I want. I make sure it runs. I forget about the test afterward. Or I forget about that state that I needed to be in because the next test could be in a totally different state. If we do that for databases, it's a lot harder. And that's why database testing is such a challenge. That even tools like T-SQL-T, I think, give you about a third of the real solution.
Yeah. I mean, they try. And I think it's worth trying. It's worth, automating what you can automate. But yeah, it's difficult.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. I know people who are on that project, and they are very smart people doing very smart things.
Right.
They're just having to push a rock uphill.
Right.
So Solomon,
I like T-SQL-T to the extent that we have it implemented where I work. I mean, it's a sweet product and it's helped us in small ways. I would say small ways because that's just a limitation of more of our testing environment than it is of their tool. But that's how it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Solomon asks, does code review cover just the actual code or schema change or also the release script, which is a type of code? Yeah, it should cover release scripts. Even so, if you're automatically generating release scripts or change scripts from a source control based tool, then even still, I'd probably review the change scripts because who knows what kind of craziness an auto-generated change script does. There can be mistakes in release code that can have real consequences, like deleting data. even just the order in which you do a release process. If you try to create the procedure, but you haven't created the table yet, or you haven't altered the column yet, or you try to make a data update before changing the key, yeah, those types of things can break your release and leave you in a state that you didn't anticipate and that you're having to manually dig yourself out from.
Or
So,
you drop
yes.
you drop a view with complicated grants, and then you're hosed because you got to redo them all. Not that I did that
Sure.
today.
It's
yes,
pretty
thinking
difficult
about.
though to automate some of the things we do on release scripts, because it's only the human knows why they're doing what they're doing many times. And no, running in where I am, we decided not to run the automated linter on the review, release scripts for that reason. Is because there's no real. It's difficult to enforce anything as far as release scripts go, because there's too many scenarios, too many different things that can go wrong.
Sure. And it also kind of gets into deployment practices where you've got two processes. I sort of described one of them, which is you have your central model that's in source control and you develop change scripts, possibly through an automated tool. The
Right,
other process
the one
is
the Visual Studio one has, like Kevin, it compares the what you changed with what was earlier and generates a script.
correct.
The thing is, what I was telling, what's his name, the guy on Vicky's team, sorry, I forget his name, that young man, I was telling him that none of those scripts are rerunnable. So unless you have a really small environment where you're absolutely sure you run it once and you're done, that's not of much use to me.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's the one practice. The other practice is sort of coming at it from the reverse side. You develop the change scripts and then apply those change scripts. And you can kind of resync the state to what's in source control based off of those change scripts. I think that's going to be the better practice in most data environments. I went to a Grant Fritchie session a little while back, and he was talking about those two practices and basically says, Redgate has a tool for the former, and Grant works for Redgate. Basically, Redgate has a tool for the former. They license it out to Visual Studio to be used there. So that's basically the same tool. Use the other technique. Don't use the technique that they've built the tool around. Use this other practice because of the problems that Mala mentions. As you get larger environments, as you get more complicated changes, those automated tools to try to flash your state, you're going to have to make manual changes to the scripts anyhow. So Enhanced
No,
QC
that
asks,
thing they have in Visual Studio, that's actually really nice, and that it'll just compare the changes you made to the older version and generate something for you. It's just not refined enough to put to use in a real world yet. I hope they'll work on it, but it's nice to have something automatically generate something like that for you.
yeah, I think it's probably easier to store state and kind of use a tool like dbup to fast forward to
dbup,
that
Kevin?
latest state.
dbup, okay, I haven't heard of that.
Yep, dbup.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So Enhanced QC asks, deduplication is probably a nightmare as well in databases. What's a primary data deduplication routine in the database architecture world? Architecture world, they're in ivory towers, so that may not be the best the best answer. All right, as far as architecture goes, this is where we talk about the rules of database normalization, where we want to focus on, well, the whole point is to structure data as it exists in the world. And one of the benefits that we get from structuring data as it exists in the world is natural protection from duplication. You have a description of a thing as the unique description of it. There can only be one of this thing because it has these specific attributes, and therefore we know what it is. This is how we describe it. This is how we store it. And by making that unique, we cannot have a second exactly like it, because there shouldn't be a second exactly like it. So rules of normalization will get you there. Now, if you have existing databases, there are always going to be shortcuts people have taken. It can have all the same attributes, but what if it's in a different table or column or whatever else databases have? Well, I think you're still going to have normalization be the answer, because the question would be a thing in a table and a thing in a different table. Why do you have two tables? If it is a thing, it exists in one place, and it should exist in one place. If there are qualities of a thing, those may exist in a different table. So, for example, I may have a person, and that person has addresses, and I may have a separate address table that connects to a person table, and where a person may have multiple addresses over time. But that's just sort of the structure of the data. Qualities or attributes may be bifurcated. Yeah, that's a word I like. And I'm not doing a great job of explaining this, I know, because I don't want to get into a primer on normalization, because that would be quite a bit of time. I do have a talk on the topic, although
that was very 2021. Yeah.
Yeah, I did it for TriPass. I think it might have been recorded, so it may be on the TriPass list on YouTube. But it's called Perfectly Normal. Is a advanced primer on normalization, and gets to the point of how do we get to a state of normalization. And this is what database architecture is going to use to try to prevent redundancy, to remove unnecessary redundancy. And in practice, if you don't have a perfectly designed database architecture, there are things that you can do to review whether or not there is redundant data and possibly remove it. Question takes a seminar. It just takes a very long talk. That's all. Cute alternate name. Why be normal? I like that one.
I love that. That's a great line. Why be normal?
So, but if two different things, entities, not rows, have the same attributes, that does not make them the same, and therefore should not be shoved into the same table due to the coincidence of looking the same. No, I agree with that, Solomon. And this is where, for example, I would not necessarily have a junk table of, well, all of my things that have a key and that have a value, I'll just dump it in a key value table. So I do agree with that. If a thing is unique, maybe we have a series of lookup tables that have some unique name and a description, a code and a description. But in that case, the same thing doesn't show up in those two different tables, because the two different tables still represent different things. And this is where we can get into some real hair splitting. But ideally, those two tables, even if they do have the same shape, like you're saying, are still different. And a thing in here is not a thing in there. And I shouldn't have any rules that prohibit me from having a thing in here, but not in there. Because at that point, we now have to have a more detailed discussion about what these represent and why there would be a prohibition on you may be in here, but not in there, if they're totally different things. And again, even with that, we could come up with exceptions. There's hair splitting upon hair splitting. This is angels dancing on the head of a pen. And like I said, Ivory Tower. I enjoy Ivory Tower probably more than the next person. Though it can get pretty annoying, especially in a code review. for a loose example, just because a date time value looks like an int, it doesn't make it an int. Unless it's in a warehouse. But yes, and I do agree with you, Solomon. And that's where, again, we get to, do you have proper definitions of things? Are you properly representing the real world in your architecture? Because if you're not, you can end up with strange problems. And that includes unnecessarily lumping things together, just like unnecessarily spreading them apart. Now, as a reference to the very recent Exchange server bug. Oh, there's going to be some new stuff that's coming up, especially when... Oh, I forget which applications it's in, but some dates... Actually, it may be Exchange, where some dates are stored as an integer, and it's like 2021 12 31 06 blah blah blah. So it takes up the full length of the integer. And once you get to, what is it, 2022, you get to a point where you can have integer overflows. 20220101 as it rolled over on int max size. Yeah, antivirus or anti-spam thing. Yeah, something was recently hit, and there will be a few more things along those lines. And that's where people, like you said, stored a date as an integer, thinking that it's good enough. We're going to get, that's our preview of the year Y, the Y 2.038K problem, where all of those 32-bit systems overflow. Did you hear about the Microsoft Y 2022 thing? Yeah, that's what we're talking about, Mr. Lysanki, where Y2K22, 2K22, I believe, would be a basketball game. But then 2K Sports would sue us. Suggested future talk topic, what the muck? Anti-pattern nightmares. Yeah.
Nice name.
It's yeah. I can see it going a little. It's very easy to mispronounce. That's the problem. Somebody might, as far as Balderisms go, it may be a little bit too close. SQL Server agent job scheduling uses ints for date and times, but at least they're two separate fields, so they will not break. Right, until we get to the year 2 billion. In the year 2 billion, we're going to have some real problems.
I am pretty sure I'm not going to be around to see what this problem is.
Oh, I can't wait till the Y10K problem. Once we get to the year 10,000, it's going to be interesting. Although, in fairness, I believe that BattleTech will happen in real life. So by the year 3000, we're barely going to have computers. Japanese and character calendars don't have this problem, depending on how they store information. It's all the underlying data types.
True. Japan's calendar is based on the emperor. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if in that case, we'll just store it as a tiny int till you have the 257th year of an emperor. Then they're all messed up just as well. But as far as code reviews go, so Mike, you've got a checklist.
Yes. So interestingly, one of the things that this is like business requirement specific. So we do a lot of read queries. We do a lot of writing queries. That's why I was always fascinated with Grant Fitch. He said you shouldn't be writing queries that much. So essentially, we got together. Like so the things that we were talking about, Mala had referenced earlier about this, that, or the other being kind of subjective or sometimes unnecessary, or not really bugs, but preferences. We kind of got together and kind of defined what our group felt like code review would be and what would make things successful. So I'll just do a big whack through it, and then we can stop, or if anybody has questions. So it has to be in the code repository, right? It has, like, in order for you to pass this. So we review it and we essentially do a checklist. So if you don't have it readily available and ready to run, it won't pass. We have naming conventions that we review, like what you alias things, because we do a lot of common stuff, and so it would be really messy if we have like, let's say, a service request or a call ticket in a call center. We call it the same thing, right? Because everybody references that table a lot, so we call it the same thing. We also do, like, we have to reference schema names, and we do that for a variety of reasons. So we kind of do the full schema references. So like schema dot table. So we write that out in our code, because there's different environments and things will fail if you're lazy and don't put that stuff there. We have a generic kind of like subjective thing, which, like, do you think that, as an analyst developer, do you think that this code is meeting the requirements of the business document? We avoid hard coding, and there's a reason for that. So this is kind of domain specific for us, and that is that we avoid, like, writing long lists of things like this value is, or this lookup value is like 1, 7, or 8. We don't. We have like a storage container for that type of stuff, because otherwise, if you're working on a project that has 13 scripts and a client comes back and is like, we need to change this or that, you're going to have to go into 13 scripts and change this long list of things or whatever. So it's more of a maintenance thing for us. So if you have a lot of hard-coded elements, then we tend to not pass your code depending on why you've done it. So we make you kind of defend yourself, like, why are you doing that? We run all the code, and some of our code is long running for a variety of reasons I won't get into, but I will tell you that I really try to short circuit that process. Like, I look at if it runs long, or if it runs, or I'll wrap it in a select one from this thing to make sure it runs. We double check all the join order. Like, if you're not careful, if you do a left join before an inner join, and that you're getting the results you expect, you're not getting your own gotchas. Basic performance things, like, are you doing anything obvious, like sargable violations, etc., that that could make the code a lot more smart? And then also documentation. So we have a bunch of things on documentation, like you have to have a detailed commented out header or footer that's like, this is the ticket, this is what it's for, this is the IRB number, or whatever it is. We generally actually document the runtime, which is a little bit administrative, but, like, we do that because it gives you an idea of, like, the size of the project, and then also if you are able to, like, improve it. So then we have kind of like special things, like when you're doing automation. If you're doing automation in SSIS, we kind of like have separate issues for that. So that's like the big swath, like, of all the nitty gritty things that we do.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, and documenting the runtime demonstrates the intelligence of it. Yeah, that's giving an idea that we expect this to take X number of seconds, and if the query is taking 30 seconds, okay, we expected it would take that long. By contrast, if it's taking 30 seconds and you expect it to be milliseconds, that's something where we have an obvious pain point and can look for those times versus expected times. As far as general principles go, this is as solid as, I think, many other types of code reviews. this is how cryptography works. Teach that or show test that documents blah. Check documents, see how long it takes them to do the math against it, and test that it's taking that long. Yeah, because if it's taking a lot less time, then the algorithm may not be implemented correctly, or you might have demonstrated a vulnerability in the algorithm if you're getting the same results.
Yeah, and I remember we had a situation where I know in Oracle we have like optimizer 14 and we moved up to optimizer 15, and I guess it takes a couple of months for the optimizer to get smarter. So we would go into the session and say alter session, go back to this other older optimizer. So that is another, like, if you're habitually documenting, you can like start to rule out issues like, is this just database traffic? Is it the optimizer? Is it I made a mistake?
Yeah. It also makes sense when you're thinking about upgrades, where do I have any regressions? That's a hard thing. If you've got older data, you could compare older versus newer, pre-upgrade versus post-upgrade, and get an idea, but also having those expectations of, this is where I think it should be, this is where our customer says it needs to be, therefore we want to make sure that we're staying within that recommended boundary. It's a good plan. It's something that I don't think we tend to think about a lot when developing. And when it comes to query tuning, we're just, let's make it as fast as possible, when the answer really is, let's make it as fast as it needs to be for the customer to be satisfied. And
Right.
that may not be the same thing. Level of effort differences there. So as far as the specific rules go, this is going back to, well, your environment may vary, and a lot of times code reviews end up being, what are things that have bitten me in the past? What are things that we commonly see as problems in an environment, and focusing so much on that. And given the broad scope of so many operations, a database, a single ticket in a ticketing system might end up with dozens or hundreds of scripts. That's something that takes a very long time to code review, and to do it comprehensively is a joke. It doesn't matter if you're doing it in a full room, half the people won't pay attention. If you're doing peer reviews, you got me for about 10 minutes before my mind starts going off on little tangents. And for a large-scale database change, the problem is it's so easy for that to snowball. It's a lot easier in application code to limit down the scope of your change, to say, okay, we're going to do A, then we'll do B, then we'll do C. Because those are roughly independent sets of code, so I can have a code review on A, check that in, get that deployed, do a review on B, get that checked in and deployed, do a review on C, get that checked in, deployed. And I have 3 files and 30 lines of code to talk about. That's a lot easier mentally to stay engaged in than, here's my 90 file code review, and 86 of them are just me changing this inner join criterion because we added a new column to the key.
Mm-hmm.
Power attacks on
that makes
crypto.
total sense,
Yeah. So Mike says, actually, power attacks on crypto is a technique for cracking it, not testing it. Yeah. That's where I was going, where if you have something that's taking significantly less time, that's you're essentially shaving bits off, and now your 2 to the umpteen thousand becomes 2 to the umpteen thousand minus 1, which means that it's now half as effective. And you eventually shave off enough of those, and now it becomes practical to reverse your end result, versus something that is wildly impractical outside of a quantum state, which we're not going to talk about because I'm not going to pretend I understand that. I will go very wrong very quickly if we start talking quantum.
That was a great show.
Quantum Leap?
Yeah, that's what you meant, right?
Yeah. Scott Bakula, great guy. Rainbow tables are scary to read about at Sans. Yeah, there are good rainbow tables for MD5 hashes up to 12, 14 bytes. Gigantic databases with hash outputs. Yeah, that's all a rainbow table is. It's essentially, I have gone through and I can one-way hash, so I've got the end results, and it's essentially putting an index on the end results to get back to what was the input for this one-way hash. And if you've got the time, if you've got the disk space, if you've got the compute power, you can create one of these. That's why, for example, we don't tend to use things like MD5 for any sort of realistic, anything near pretending to be secure for hashing. It's okay for checksums. Here is my checksum. Here are the inputs. Here's the checksum that you get out of it. Make sure that those are the same, because otherwise you don't have the binary file that I gave you or that I intended to give you. But yeah, otherwise very easy to reverse out. So not something you would store a password in. If you do try to store a password in it, bad idea. MD5 and SHA are still used for forensic data collection in courts of law. Right, because you can create that checksum and prove that you have that the files are the same as what you claim they were, that there have been no modifications. So in that regard, it's not that I'm trying to protect any information. I'm not trying to secure any information. It is instead, I am trying to prove that this is still the same evidence that we came in with. Similar to, I have chain of custody documentation that says who has had this computer, who's had this disk, who's touched this image, what they did with it, and we can prove throughout these people have had it, that it hasn't been out of the records keeping room. It's been in a locked, sealed room for this amount of time. No one's had a chance to tamper with it. So it is still good for that. The two have a non-overlap hash forward image space, so using both makes them unbroken. Yeah, that's interesting. So the combination of the two, it might be quicker than some things. Oh, it's definitely a lot quicker than... it's a lot quicker, and there's a lot of built-in support in applications going back decades. So it's not intended for hiding data. It's actually intended for ensuring the legitimacy of what you have versus what you expected to have. So that's interesting to know. And as far as code reviews go, that's
we passed.
Hopefully. We got about 10 minutes in and my mind started wandering. Microsoft recommends a weird multipass hash. Interesting, haven't studied it. I'm sure they recommend things. I'm sure other people recommend things as well. They're all trying to... Here's a cool new thing. You should use it because reasons. And that's fine. And if there ends up being a problem where you have hash collision in the future somehow, or you have some sort of wacky scenario where I can recreate hash, I don't know. I'm now spitballing what could possibly go wrong, even if there is no practical answer that could allow it to go wrong. But it's good to have options.
It certainly is.
That's where in encryption, yeah, it's good to have more than one known not to be broken yet good algorithm. Yes. What is a hash collision? Thank you for asking a question that I can answer, Rednello. So the idea, all right, a hash is a one-way operation. So really simple. Let's say I'm going to take a character and give you a numeric representation of the character. So A becomes 1, B becomes 2, etc. Now, in an ideal world, This is one way, meaning that I have a base character and I have an output, and you can't get back to the input from the output. This is what makes a one-way hash one way. And that's where we talk about rainbow tables to sort of build out all of those outputs and then index back to the input. A hash collision is where I've got two separate sets of input that will both give me the same output. In an ideal world with a one-way hash, you have exactly one output per input. So I have my collection of inputs, it generates an output. And I should never be able to have any other inputs other than this one give me that same output. In practice, if you're going to a smaller space, you will necessarily have collisions. Like if I have a MD5 hash that is 4 bytes long, well, there's only so many bits in here. And as long as your input space is significantly larger than your output space, probably going to have a collision somewhere in there. The question is, can you determine that this input and this input will both give you the same output? And that's where you get to a real problem, because we could have accidental collisions, and that's not necessarily a problem, but it's when an attacker realizes that if I change these to this other thing that I want, that I can get a collision. So this is a problem. Now, it's also a problem in thinking about things like data warehousing. We can use hash bytes in data warehousing to determine, did a record change? I can have the hash bytes of the concatenation of all of my attributes in a table, or what should go into a dimension, and concatenate them all together, do a hash of that so I have a much smaller thing to work with, and compare that to the hash of what's in the warehouse currently. And that way, if the two hashes match up, I have the same data. I don't need to make a change. If the two hashes don't match up, then I know that I should make this update. If you have a hash collision, we actually have different data between what's in the source system and what's in the warehouse, and they should be updated, but our system fails. So that is the short version of hash collisions and bringing it back into the database world. In general, the longer the hash mechanism, the fewer collisions you're going to have. So Enhanced QC mentions SHA-3, which you have, if I remember right, 128, 256, and 512 variants. SHA-3 256 is pretty common. I like to use 512 just because I like big numbers. But having 256 bits of space for variants means that the likelihood of collision is quite low. And also, the other thing about a good hashing algorithm is a small change leads to a big change in your hash. So that's where you're going to have less likely to really experience a collision. You could accidentally experience a collision if the collection of these bytes radically changes and it just happens to land on the same output. But a minor change or a realistic change that you would see in tables, where I change one attribute, one column, the person's last name changed when she got married. And that's very unlikely to lead to a collision. I am overlooking the fact that Bitcoin is written with SHA-3. The NSA wrote SHA-3. It still works. At least SHA-3 still works. And with that little wink, wink, nudge, nudge, they also wrote a cryptocurrency white paper in 1995. Huh, that is interesting. Before I go down that rabbit hole, because trust me, I have opinions. It's probably a little better than hot takery. The real problem with SSL is it's still protected with some MD5 and SHA hashes, and even with some older important sites, because they view the encryption algorithm as more important than the hash. It's not. I was not aware of that. But then at this point, I don't think anybody's, well, I shouldn't say anybody. TLS has replaced SSL. So unless you're saying this is also a problem with TLS, it seems like that's just who's using SSL itself. Yes, is still a problem with TLS. Okay. So that could be an issue. HTTPS certs. Okay. Yeah, X509. I avoided bringing that up because X509, there have been attacks where you're able to change a lot of details in the certificate and add garbage to get a collision. And that was a really interesting scenario because in that case, people kind of reversed what was the process, what garbage did I need to add to make a malicious change to this particular certificate and turn it and still have it look legitimate, but now it's pointing to my bad guy website and saying that it's totally secure. So that was an interesting thing. That was like a decade ago, I think. But in any event, we're going to call it a night. Thank you, everybody. And we'll catch you for the first Advanced DBA meeting of the year next Tuesday. I hope to see you there. Until then, everyone, have a great evening.